And welcome to the Graduate Center. My name is Chase Robinson. I'm the interim president of the Graduate Center. And it is a great pleasure and privilege to make a few words by way of introduction before I introduce the introducer. The Graduate Center, as many of you will know, is home to about 5,000 students, 1,800 faculty, depending on how you count them, 30 PhD programs, 35 research centers and institutes. We are a matrix of doctoral training, advanced research, and public programming. We educate the leading scholars of tomorrow, and we create and interpret bodies of knowledge from anthropology through to urban education, which we disseminate for the public good. Now, literary and political theory, and now increasingly economic and scientific theory, have been and are becoming even more so strengths of the Graduate Center. And tonight it is a great pleasure to welcome and introduce to you two grand theorists. The topic of tonight's event is An American Utopia, Fredric Jameson in conversation with Stanley Aronowitz. Now, as I said, I will be turning the microphone over to distinguished Professor Andre Aciman, who has the pleasure of introducing our two speakers. But I should say in closing that this is very much a coordinated effort that reflects the collaborative nature of our faculty and our students. And the proof of that is the number of entities within the Graduate Center which are co-sponsoring the event. The main driver is Professor Aciman himself, distinguished professor, as I said, of comparative literature, and indeed the program in comparative literature is an important sponsor, and I should say parenthetically that we're all very pleased to see that the program in comparative literature is now offering a critical theory certificate. Joining the program in comparative literature is the Writers' Institute, the Center for the Study of Culture, Technology, and Work, the Office of Public Programs, the Center for the Humanities, the Doctoral Students' Council, and the Political Science Graduate Student Association. So I thank all of them for working together to bring the night's activities to fruition, as I thank and pass the microphone over to Andre Aciman. Andre.
Good evening. It's really a pleasure to see such a full house. There are two other rooms that are equally full and that have live streaming. So this is good. Thank you very much, President Robinson. One of the things that Chase Robinson did not say is that his office was also part of the symbiotic relation that we have here in what is called sort of a collaborative endeavor at the Graduate Center. Everybody works together. The other thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that all this is also possible because students are involved in bringing about an event like this. And I should also mention that there's one student in particular, Claire Summers, who's sitting there, who is responsible for making these things happen because she's literally indefatigable and intrepid. And if you think you don't have to be intrepid and indefatigable to bring about such an event, you don't know anything about events. What makes this event particularly meaningful to the Graduate Center is that it represents the capping of our long and arduous struggle to bring about a critical theory certificate program. That means that graduate students at the Graduate Center in the humanities and the social sciences will take 5 courses and earn with that a certificate in critical theory. A wonderful boon to people who are thinking ahead about job prospects. We have done so well. If you think that's irrelevant, yes, you're laughing because you know how meaningful that is. It's a good thing. But it was a struggle to bring it about, and it takes a lot of, again, pugnaciousness to bring it on. We have done successfully this, and now we're moving on to a new venture, which is another program for the people in literature in particular, a translation certificate. We haven't decided yet if it's going to be a certificate or not, but that's where we are headed. So we look for more work, more innovation, and more enterprise. Today is an important day for me because most of you here are graduate students, but it represents also a moment in my own graduate year. In 1973, I was in my first year as a graduate student in comparative literature, and I was flummoxed and I was lost because we were in the cusp of a very meaningful moment. And at that point, I remember a green-colored book. It had a green cover, and it was called The Prison House of Language, written by Professor Jameson, published in 1972. And it was, for me, a great help to understand, A, what was linguistics and why was everybody talking about linguistics? Never heard of that subject before. Second of all, what was the formalist movement in Russia? What did it sort of promise? And third of all, what on earth in 1972-73 was structuralism? Most of you may not know what structuralism is because you know what post-structuralism is. But in those years, it was very confusing. So it gives me an enormous amount of pleasure to introduce Professor Jameson, who is the William A. Lane Jr. Professor of Comparative Literature and Professor of Romance Languages at Duke University. He's a noted cultural critic. He's the author of several books, including The Political Unconscious, Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act, Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, Archaeologies of Future, most recently, The Antinomism of Realism, and the second book that I purchased, Marxism and Form. In those years, Professor Jameson received the award for Lifetime Scholarly Achievement from the Modern Language Association. There is a moment in the Gospel of Mark when Jesus says, "A prophet is not without honor, except in his own town, among his relatives, and in his own home." Prophets are never praised in their home, but tonight we're really happy to praise one of our own. Stanley Aronowitz is a distinguished professor at the CUNY Graduate Center and the director of the Center for the Study of Culture, Technology, and Work. He's an advocate for organized labor and the author of several books, including False Promises, The Shaping of American Working Class Consciousness, Left Turn, Forging a New Political Future, and most recently, Taking It Big, C. Wright Mills, and the Making of Political Intellectuals. He's also the co-founder of Situations Journal. In 2012, Professor Aronowitz, our own prophet, received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Stony Brook University's Center for Study of Working Life. I leave you to these two highly gifted and competent men to discuss, read, talk, and possibly argue. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andre, and I'm very happy to be here, in particular to celebrate this critical theory certificate, which is certainly close to my own heart. Now, having spent a number of years arguing that utopia is to be defined as what we can't imagine within this society, and that that's precisely its use, its political use, I find myself in the embarrassing position of having to try to invent one after all. There is, in fact, something like a reality principle within fantasy. Even to fantasize what doesn't exist, you have to be able to talk yourself into a framework in which dreaming about it is still somehow practically possible. So I find myself in a no man's land between political strategy, and utopian aspiration, in which those boundary lines again become blurred or undetectable, and in which I can't be sure whether I'm proposing a political program or a utopian vision, neither of which, according to me, ought to be possible any longer. Why not? Well, the left once had a political program. It was called revolution. No one seems to believe in it anymore, partly because the agency supposed to bring it about has disappeared, partly because the system it was supposed to replace has become too complicated and too omnipresent to begin to imagine replacing it, partly because nobody believes in revolution anymore and the very language associated with it has become as old-fashioned and as archaic as that of the Founding Fathers. It's easier, someone once said, to imagine the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. And with that, the idea of revolution overthrowing capitalism seems to have vanished. Well, let's be fair. The left did have another political strategy, whatever you think about it, and that was reformism, sometimes in contradistinction to revolutionary communism, called socialism. But I'm afraid no one believes in that any longer either. The reformist or social democratic parties are in a complete shambles. They have no programs any longer, save perhaps to regulate capitalism so it doesn't do any catastrophic damage. There is omnipresent corruption, both in these parties and in the system at large, which is in any case too enormous and too complex to be susceptible of any decisive tinkering which might improve it, let alone lead to something you could truly call systemic change. Social democracy is in our time irreparably bankrupt, and communism seems dead. Thus, it would seem both of Gramsci's celebrated alternatives, the war of maneuver and the war of position, no longer seem theoretically adequate to the current situation. Fortunately, there exists a third kind of transition out of capitalism, which is less often acknowledged, let alone discussed, and that's what was historically called dual power. Indeed, dual power will be my political program and will lead to my utopian proposal, as I'll try to show in a moment. The phrase is, of course, associated with Lenin and his description of the coexistence of the provisional government and the network of Soviets or worker soldiers' councils in 1917, a genuine transitional period if there ever was one, but it has also existed in numerous other forms of interest to us today. I would most notably single out the way in which organizations like the Black Panthers or Hamas function to provide daily services, food kitchens, garbage collection, health care, water inspection, and the like, in areas neglected by some official central government. In such situations, power moves to the networks to which you turn for practical help and leadership on a daily basis. In effect, they become an alternate government without officially challenging the ostensibly legal structure. The point at which a confrontation and a transfer of power takes place, at which the official government begins to wither away, at which revolutionary violence appears, will of course vary with the overall political and cultural context itself. It's not necessary to supply a historical catalog of these anomalous structures of transitional coexistence, which range from the dualities of church and state in some periods to that of local communes in the French Revolution, most notably the first commune, Commune de Paris, that supported Danton's still informal power. What might be more useful would be to indicate the kinds of events or structures which cannot be considered as relevant examples of dual power. Enclaves, for example, such as Chiapas or Utopia, or the free zones of the Maroons, which are spatially separate from the dominant state and have their own autonomy. I would also suggest that the current form of the mass uprising from the Arab Spring to Occupy does not really qualify either. The first of these two revolutionary phenomena, the enclave, stands as a kind of state within a state. The second, the uprising, as a spatial event which pioneers information technology as a substitute for political organization. Nor would I want to underplay the importance of the residual forms of the more classic forms of revolution I mentioned at the beginning, the armed uprising or guerrilla warfare, serving to demonstrate the weaknesses of the state apparatus and its incapacity to constitute a genuine popular government, to use a word we probably need to replace, as you'll see in a moment. As for the older political parties, such as the various socialist ones I've mentioned, although they're incapable of achieving any real change in their own right, they could nonetheless, at their best, serve as platforms for discursive struggle and as vehicles for the renewed public consideration of hitherto repressed and stigmatized transformational policies, such as the wholesale nationalization of banks, insurance companies, and utilities, the taxation of the great corporations and the gradual transfer of wealth from the upper 1% of the population, and the eventual abolition of inheritance as such, the establishment of a minimum annual wage for everyone, and the reorganization of the political system, the dissolution of NATO, the reform of an unequal federalism, the popular control of the media, free health care and education, universal Wi-Fi, and so on and so forth. The function of political parties is to legitimate these slogans and demands and to make them thinkable once again, even if they can't achieve them, and that's accomplishment enough, I would think. As for genuine revolutionary change, however, that will be the function, as I want to suggest here, of dual power. And it's now time to examine our society as it is today in order to weigh the chances for such dual power and to identify those already existing institutions which could be its vehicle. Traditionally, of course, it's to the labor unions which the left has always turned as to its base and its natural constituency. The very nature of the proletariat has been transformed and enlarged by the transformation of peasants into farm workers, by underpaid service industries, and by the white-collar workers in a now immense government bureaucracy. On the other hand, as everyone knows, the original industrial character of work has itself been reduced by informational technology, and the power of the unions greatly diminished. Traditionally, in any case, there was always a tension between the unions and the political parties, which had different aims. Nor must we underestimate the success of anti-union propaganda during the dissolution of the New Deal, that is, for the whole of the Cold War period, by way of alleged association with the mafia, with corruption, with the stigma of identification as a special interest, ridiculous expression, as we call lobbying groups over here. The defeat in Wisconsin, after one of the most encouraging political developments in recent years, is sad proof that this kind of anti-union prejudice persists unabated. So unions no longer offer an effective chance at dual power, even if they ever did. And maybe we should conclude, actually, that in this society it's the mafia which offers the most suggestive example of already existing dual power. However, its effectiveness seems to have waned as significantly as that of the unions themselves. What other candidates can we identify to play the role I've been imagining? Almost all of them have suffered the institutional debilitation endemic to late capitalism. Take, for example, the post office. In Europe, it's a kind of savings bank as well. Here, it offers a parallel to the census and could presumably, along with your motor vehicle agency, secure your voting rights. It distributes retirement, pension, and social security checks, and is apparently even developing some kind of institutional relationship with its once mortal enemy, the internet. It mints money in the form of stamps. It used to be an important source of employment, particularly for those seeking to drop out of the system as inconspicuously as possible, and generally on foot. It offers a unique experience of nature as well as of urban space, and an equally unique relationship to the community where that still exists. But once again, information technology now stands as an absolute historical break with whatever utopias might have been imagined on the basis of this uniquely relational system. The professionals do not seem any more promising. The legal profession, for example, could scarcely stand in competition with the state insofar as it is the state in the first place, something confirmed by the loss of autonomy of the judiciary system in our time. For an aging population, the medical profession might seem to offer more promising material insofar as its benefits and necessities come doubled by that sort of moral authority with which Plato wanted to surround his philosopher kings. But the privatization of the hospitals and the institutionalization of the private practitioner bid fair to strip away that aura, and the doctors have for the most part had to bow to the economic power of insurance companies and pharmaceutical giants, while their guilds, such as the AMA, which once functioned as a powerful anti-political lobby on the order of the National Rifle Association, are probably no longer very effective. Then there are the churches, many of which do function as a nation within a nation and provide solace and the proverbial haven in a heartless world to families alienated by late capitalism. Nor was Robespierre wrong, it seems to me, to call, following Jean-Jacques, for a state religion, a secular religion of reason of some kind, insofar as neither had any other concept for what necessarily binds a society together. I suggest that rather than religion as such, it's the existence of a fetish that provides social cohesion in those instances in which the latter has been possible. The American Constitution, the French conception of the République, the Japanese emperor system, certain repressed national languages. These are so many examples of fetishes which have proved more successful than the usual forms of patriotism and dynastic succession, and any utopia hopeful of duration will have to discover such a fetish, for it cannot be invented, and probably already secretly exists in the hearts of its citizens in whatever as yet unimaginable form. Excuse me. Religion, however, is clearly the most dangerous of all candidates for dual power, based as it is on what Kant would have called a subreption, a mistaking of superstructure for base. Religion, as we've seen for some time, is an invitation to all kinds of private obsessions and violence, but I don't either recommend an enlightenment program for the elimination of religion in general and the specific religions in particular. They should be allowed to run as wild as possible, but should be abandoned to the sphere of culture, as I'll try to argue in a moment. What is then left as a vehicle for dual power? Stanley Aronowitz once observed that in the future, as computers are down 20% of the time, the true levers of power will lie in the hands of the computer repairmen, with a proletariat of third world women turning out the machines and a financial elite reaping the benefits. That may be. But we're not talking about power as such here, but rather an ambiguous political framework in which, in a dual system, power can be observed to slip from one to the other. This is then the moment to explain, if you haven't already guessed it, that there's only one system left which can function in so truly revolutionary a fashion. This is a thought that must have first come to me many years ago, inspired by an image by one of our greatest political cartoonists of that time, or forever. I think it must have been in the first year of Eisenhower's presidency, probably not still during the campaign, when the last vestiges of the New Deal still survived, and in particular Truman's ill-fated campaign for socialized medicine on the then contemporary British labor model, and Canada's adoption of it beginning in Saskatchewan in those years. Ike, presumably still in full military regalia, perches informally on the edge of his desk in the Oval Office and observes conversationally, well, if they want socialized medicine, they have only to join the army, as I did. The implication is as crystal clear as a thunderbolt. Only the Army constitutes a state within the state capable of assuming the structural function and promise of dual power. And this alarming proposition will make up the argument of the concluding part of this talk from both political and utopian perspectives. Now, the Army we currently have is what's called a volunteer army, that is a commercial profession like any other. I probably don't have to remind you of the history of citizens' armies, from the Greeks to Machiavelli, and very much including the French Revolution. These armies, based on the draft, had political missions, most notably in modern times to forge the nation out of a variety of local and provincial populations, sometimes not even speaking the national language, itself a political creation of the new national state in any case. To be sure, nowadays the media have already done that for us, but the usefulness of the analogy lies in the fact that in our federal system, the Army is virtually the only institution to transcend the jurisdictions of state laws and boundaries, divisions which are among the most important counter-revolutionary principles embedded in the American Constitution, itself one of the most successful counter-revolutionary documents ever devised. No genuine systemic change can take place here without an abrogation of the Constitution. A foundational fetish, as I've claimed, and in fact, a document the left itself would be as loath to forfeit as the right, owing to the protections of the Bill of Rights. The signal advantage of the Army as a system is that it transcends that document without doing away with it. It coexists with it at a different spatial level and becomes thereby potentially an extraordinary instrument in the erection of dual power. You also know, I'm sure, that Nixon ended the draft in order to put an end to popular and, in particular, student resistance to the war in Vietnam. Johnson had already modified the draft with hosts of class and racial exemptions in order to limit its political impact. More recently, during the Iraq War, what we may call the Rumsfeld period, this professional army has been further privatized, and I insist on this relevance of this term for the way in which it underscores the relationship with the variety of other privatizations all over the world inaugurated by the Reagan-Thatcher regimes. Rumsfeld further privatized this already specialized and salaried private army by outsourcing many of its functions to private corporations of the Blackwater type, and by introducing complex advanced technology in order to render other portions of the military workforce redundant, that is, by downsizing them via mechanization, a process Marx already described in Capital. I put it to you that this very significant moment in the history of the modern army had a political purpose above and beyond its adaptation of current late capitalist business practices. And that purpose was to remove this small professional group possessing Max Weber's proverbial monopoly of violence from any possibility of mass democratic action, and furthermore to assimilate it to the structure of the police force, which it now has become on a global scale. So the first step in my utopian proposal is, so to speak, the renationalization of the Army along the lines of any number of other socialist candidates for nationalization, some of which I've already mentioned, and by reintroducing the draft to transform the present armed forces back into that popular mass force capable of coexisting successfully with an increasingly unrepresentative representative government, into a vehicle for mass democracy rather than the representative kind. Now, inasmuch as you'll continue to associate the Army with the various coups d'etat of modern times all over the world, as well as with all the wars it's been called on to wage in recent years and is still being called on to wage, I will at once specify the most important steps in the process. First of all, the body of eligible draftees would be increased by including everyone of both sexes from 16 to 50, or if you prefer, 60 years of age. That is, the entire population. Such an unmanageable population would henceforth be incapable of waging foreign wars let alone carrying out successful coups. In order to emphasize the universality of that process, let's add that the handicapped will all be found appropriate positions in the system, and that pacifists and conscientious objectors will be placed in control of arms development, arms storage, and the like. Now I need to remind you of the breadth of the military system, particularly under the pre-Rumsfeld dispensation. We can begin with medical attention, and in particular the hospitals, which, as you know, are currently in desperate straits, at a moment when the hospitals themselves, the other hospitals, the private kind, have become big business in this country to our disgrace. In our new universal system, of course, the military hospitals become a free national health service open to everyone, insofar as everyone is a service person or personnel or veteran. And the entire center of gravity of universal health care, and also I would add pharmaceutical production, disease control, and the experimentation with and production of new medicines, would now be organized around the Army. We may also assume a reorientation of education itself under its auspices, not merely for the children of this military population, but for various advanced degrees. Nowadays, it's difficult to think of any kind of advanced training, maybe except for business schools, which would not be required within this system. The Army Corps of Engineers is the obvious example. And we may think of the socialist or ex-socialist countries for models of our situation, in which the various armies included, and I think in China maybe still do, such functions as the manufacture of clothing, the production of films, the eventual production of motor vehicles, and even in China, for example, again, a writers' union in which intellectuals and writers and artists find their space and income. The Army is also notoriously the source of manpower for disaster relief, infrastructural repair and construction and the like. And the question of food supply would immediately place this institution, if it can still be called that, in charge of the ordering and supply of food production, and therefore in a controlling position for that fundamental activity as well. In fact, as this new army will no longer be defined by war and the profession of warfare, and I've avoided foreign policy in this sketch, I'm inclined to follow the utopian tradition and recommend a healthy isolationism for the new system. As war will no longer become available to shape this new army's activities, it seems clear that its place will be taken by natural disasters, of which we can expect ever more and worse ones in this climate, along perhaps with economic disasters, the economic disasters of capitalism, which can be expected to be reduced by the abolition of the banks and the gradual nationalization of whole sectors of the economy. But as our current army in the country of which it is the expression is a culture of violence, it may seem paradoxical to recommend the problem as its own solution. But consider that at once all the guns and firepower within our borders become the property of the Army itself and are thus automatically registered, and that in a universal system, rape and other forms of violence can no longer remain concealed, and the equality of men and women becomes a universal social reality so inevitable that it seems to be a mere fact of nature rather than a lofty ideal of some kind. And obviously there are many more negative features of this kind to be addressed, the social and psychological results of a society whose superstructures are organized around the supreme value of competition and its symbolic exemplifications in sexual identities, sports, business practices, and social intercourse, and encapsulated in new forms such as the high school hazing dramas and other adolescent comedy and adventure stereotypes, which set the tone and intellectual level of much of contemporary mass culture. The gradual transformation of subjectivities as they adapt or are reprogrammed to new infrastructural realities is called cultural revolution, and I'll touch on it implicitly later on. But it may be worthwhile saying something about the survival of older institutions in the situation of dual power I've been imagining. It might be well, for example, to remember that when Augustus founded the Roman Empire, as such, in distinction to the ancient kingdoms whose memory was abhorrent to that tradition, he left the institutions of the Roman Republic in place. The Senate continued to meet and to debate in its customary fashion, but no one paid any attention to it any longer. One thinks of Pierre Clastres' old analysis of the tribal chiefdom before state power. His function was not to command, but to talk, endlessly perhaps, but without authority. And this rhetorical gift remains an essential, if unanalyzed, component of modern political power, an aesthetic, perhaps a poetic component as such. But perhaps this is also the place to add another classical analogy as a way of dealing with the fear of charismatic or dictatorial leadership in the modern political unconscious. The ancients transformed this unresolvable problem of the individual leader into yet another institution, the one indeed from which we derive our word dictator, namely an individual endowed with exceptional power of exception if you prefer, for a limited period of time only, after which he sank back into equality with the population and was in fact often banished. We may indeed link this extremely provisional personal power with another ancient institution, namely the Temple of Janus, whose gates were ceremonially opened at the onset of a war and closed to signal its conclusion. I've already suggested that wars will not be tasks for this new system, which will be confronted with other kinds of collective crises, such as, above all, the ecological one. But it's always well to remember William James' famous remark, whose genial insight was made dramatic by its paradoxical misconception. For in America, wars are the moral equivalent of collective action, as witnessed the great American utopia of World War II. Yet new kinds of crises might well be moments in which charismatic dictatorship is temporarily required, and its limits and obligatory provisionality might well be signaled by the opening and closing of just such ceremonial gates as those of the Temple of Janus. But now we approach the point at which a political program necessarily of this kind necessarily passes over into that very different kind of thing, which is the utopian project. And I'm aware that these modes of thinking often seem incompatible and indeed arouse the hostility of both sides to one another. Political theory takes as its object problems without solutions. Utopian speculation, solutions without problems. The first constitutes an ontology which is necessarily obliged to work within the limits of being and of reality as it currently exists. The latter, utopian speculation, aims at a radical transformation of the present and the system. In that respect, it remains the sibling of revolutionary thought, and today occupies the place of a revolutionary politics, which has not yet fully re-emerged from the transformations of globalization and postmodernity of finance capital on a world scale. Utopian thinking demands a revision of Gramsci's great slogan. It might run like this: cynicism of the intellect, utopianism of the will. On the other hand, it's obvious that unlike revolutionary politics, the utopian impulse is always transmitted through individual rather than collective wish fulfillment, and always reflects the private fantasies of its inventors, who are readily identified as crackpots and oddballs, solitary lunatics whose ravings and imaginings draw their strength, if they have any, precisely from their distance from society and worldliness rather than their knowledge of it. Still, one might cite some eminent authorities. I quote, "The great socialist utopias of the 19th century function not as ideal models, but as group fantasies, that is, as agents of the real productivity of desire, making it possible to disinvest the current social field, to deinstitutionalize it, to further the revolutionary institution of desire itself." That's Deleuze and Guattari. Still, this is the point at which we pass from strategies about which we can reasonably argue, that one of the Universal Army, I think, to the multiplicity of fantasies and possibilities, the variety of content and decoration with which we may fill out the basic framework of the scheme. All of which is simply to say that from now on, the project and its description will be far more a private utopia of my own, for which others may wish to substitute their own particular obsessions. However, at this point, also two further things need to be said against political theory and practical politics as such. I've already commented on the antagonism between the practical political and the utopian, but I should point out again that it was there even in an earlier time when changing the system and replacing it was called revolution. The incremental changes and corrections at stake in day-to-day politics, and even yesterday in the socialist or reform parties, has always found the revolutionary or the utopian totalizing demands and positions, exacerbating and a waste of precious energies, whether they took the form of terrorist or voluntarist interventions or ivory tower frivolity, because there's always, I think, in American politics, a latent anti-intellectualism. I think we need to maintain a serious double standard here. And while supporting all the local struggles ever more urgent and desperate in the heartland of late capitalism today, we need to keep alive the ideal of a radical or revolutionary change, one which is today mostly preserved in utopian rather than in political thought. But I had in mind a more specific theoretical objection to political theory, and it has to do with the very nature of the concepts with which it works. Bellamy, looking backward, Bellamy, as is well known, not only imagined his utopian industrial or universal army, on which I draw for this sketch, he also became a practical politician whose new party, enjoyed unrivaled success in the great era of populism at the end of the 19th century. He called it the National Party. And I suppose, as my whole talk here is an exercise in American exceptionalism, I can't object to such nationalism, but let me say another word about terms like nation, which attempt to characterize the collective. That particular word seems to have had a linguistic origin. It was the name for the various foreign language-speaking students in medieval Paris, who of course spoke a non-national language, Latin, in their theology classes at the university. But I want to make a philosophical point here. I suppose it's a Kantian one, since it involves the impossibility of thinking certain kinds of things, such as that peculiar thing in itself called consciousness, which no human philosopher has ever been able to describe. I think it's the same with collective reality. That is, owing to our individuation as biological individuals, it is impossible collective reality to conceptualize. But we can list the attempts to do so: groups, communities, Gemeinschaften, mobs, crowds, tribes, clans, democracy, republic, cooperatives, peoples, nations, and even multitudes. None of these words correspond to the thing I've been calling collective, by way of picking the most neutral term I can think of, which, of course, all of these terms end up being ideological in the long run and pushing a certain kind of politics. For all such terms which cannot succeed in naming the unconceptualizable fact, not of the other, but of the multiple and the plural, end up being drawn into the service of this or that ideology. Un peuple à venir, said Deleuze wisely, implying that any implication that it already existed was an oppression and a normative or repressive ideology. This is why the plural cannot have majorities or minorities or pluralities, and incidentally, why Rousseau's Social Contract is the only intelligent political work ever written, starting as it does from this representational problem and the fact that the collectivity is unthinkable. And this is also why political science as a discipline cannot be substantive. Either it's a history, hopefully involving relentless ideological and philosophical demystification, or it produces handbooks for practical techniques in a given status quo, where it must ceaselessly camouflage its origins in the one supremely great model never to be repeated, namely Machiavelli's Prince. I can't resist giving an example of the theoretical bankruptcy of political theory, or at least of some of its contemporary ideological uses, an example which actually has some relevance to our current topic. A while back, this discipline formed a concept, lent a pseudo-scientific state by its economic language, and that was the idea of underdevelopment, a category which assumed that development and national autonomy were still possible, something the work of Robert Kurtz completely undermined and has for that reason been passed over in a conspiracy of silence. This pseudo-concept was then latterly followed and replaced by another one, a new one, of more obviously neoconservative and Iraqi-Afghan origin, and that's the slogan of the failed state. This idea is all the more ridiculous in the light of the fact that today all states are failed states, very much including the one we're in right now. None of them function. None can even be patched up with the various political strings and band-aids. Not even dictatorships work anymore. And one is reluctantly or not drawn to Samuel Huntington's scandalous proposition that the more democracy there is, the less governable a state. Indeed, that genuine democracy is ungovernable. We must, however, draw the opposite conclusion from his, and as a consequence, abandon government altogether. In fact, no one wants even a non-failed, successful, functioning state in the first place. And indeed, in practice, almost all the factions on either side are at one in denouncing the state as such. But the state is the object and the privileged subject matter of political science. And the latter is impossible simply because the thing I'm provisionally calling collectivity is not only impossible to think, it's impossible to form into any kind of state in the first place. So for collectivity, let's go a little further and substitute the even more neutral term and reality of population as such. This was also Rousseau's great insight. It is population which is both the conceptual and social scandal. That philosophically fearful thing called the other, which has haunted modern thought in recent years, is in reality plural, and it's population as such which constitutes otherness. Not overpopulation, as Malthus taught, not underpopulation, as the early 20th century French thought, along with other countries today, but simply sheer plurality and multiplicity. Nor is this scandal of the real to be avoided in the other direction by retreating into nostalgic microgroups or clans of a fantasy ethnic type, the groupuscules of today's politics, the imaginary players in the so-called culture wars of current American politics. These singularities are as ineffectual in theory as in practice as the universalities they're supposed to subvert. But I want to add a fundamental proviso to all this about social class, namely that class is not a concept of this kind. It doesn't seek to name a form of collectivity, despite numerous misuses of that kind. Class simply names an economic locality, a position within the capitalist system. The class in itself is an analytic and descriptive term, and Marx never used it any other way, however much he may have recommended organization, combination they called it, and the achievement of class consciousness. That is the notion of a class for itself, the struggle over class constitution, as Stanley puts it. Marx was, I venture to say, productivist but not workerist, and the term proletariat in the early theory, in the early writings, the early theory of the weakest link was not necessarily a class concept, although one can certainly subscribe to it in all kinds of ways, as Marcuse did in the 1960s. Marx analyzed the contradictions of capitalism, and he was also a great political strategist, but maybe not exclusively a class-based one. Anyway, I wanted you to understand that I don't include the term class among the various words for collective that I was criticizing. So indeed, my critiques of these various attempts to conceptualize and philosophize that reality I can only call as neutrally as possible the group or the collectivity must finally arrive at the following point. that from Aristotle to Kant and on, the ultimate aim and endpoint of political theory lies in the drafting of a constitution, conceived as bringing to an end revolution as such, rather than standing as its apotheosis. I like Tony Negri's masterful analysis in which he shows how the arrival of constitutional power shuts down that brief moment of freedom of the constituant, of the construction of power. But remember that the strength of the Universal Army scheme is that it cuts across the federal Constitution in a wholly novel way, transgressing its boundaries and carefully drawn limits without annulling it, leaving its map intact beneath a wholly different topology. So let me now propose another thought about the political, a revival of the most stigmatized slogan of traditional Marxism, and that's the infamous distinction between base and superstructure, which Marx, I think, only used once as far as I can see. I've often suggested in the past that it's a mistake to take this distinction of base and superstructure as a principle or dogma inherent to Marxism as a system of thought. Rather, it should always be considered as a starting point and an initial problem, as Marxism's fundamental contribution to a whole new problematic. Base and superstructure are, in other words, a beginning and not a conclusion, a laboratory experiment and not some tenet of a quasi-religious belief. But in the present context, I want to affirm this opposition far more decisively. The base or superstructure is the realm of necessity. It's the realm of production and indeed of the production of value. I won't enter here into the interminable tradition of Marxian debates about the state, except to say that in my current proposal, the state is simply the mode of organization of production itself, which is to say, in this instance, the Universal Army, something somewhere between a universal democracy, a political party, and a bureaucracy. So everyone their own bureaucrat, in other words. So the infrastructure is a Bellamy-type regimentation, an industrial army, an order which offers a feasible path to utopia at the same time that it arouses multiple kinds of fears and stirs the deepest layers of the unconscious in a variety of ways. It awakens indeed all the fears of utopia itself, while adding to them those of dystopia as such, fears of power and totalitarian military control and the like, combining the anxiety about the withering away of the state and impending anarchy with that of the overdevelopment of the state in some kind of implacable and standardizing machine. So this is certainly the moment to affirm that in this scheme, the superstructure, the realm of culture, will be conceived in counter-distinction to the base as the realm of freedom. Here, a single name sums up the whole answer and can stand in counterpoise to the tutelary image of Bellamy that presides over the infrastructure, and that name is Charles Fourier. Fourier, to my mind, represents absolute freedom and the only possible way in which a collectivity or multiplicity can coordinate its ineradicable individualities. As against most of the great revolutionary traditions, I believe it is essential to avoid left Puritanism at all costs, to reduce the inevitable repressions any social order interiorizes in order to cohere, and to welcome the most outrageous self-indulgences and personal freedoms of its citizens in all things, very much including Puritanism and the hatred of self-indulgence and personal freedoms. Fourier it is who squares this circle, and this is why at the very center of our new society there will appear a new kind of institution destined to supplant traditional government agencies and executives of all kinds. We may provisionally call this new institution the Psychoanalytic Placement Bureau. And it will, in conjunction with unimaginably complex computer systems, handle and organize all forms of employment. There'll be universal employment, of course, as well as all manner of personal and collective therapies. Mediating between the individual and the collective, and you may insert innumerable familial structures and groups of your choosing in between them. The new institution will combine the functions of a union and a hospital, an employment office and a court, a market research agency, a polling bureau, and a social welfare center. Presumably, what's left of the police as an institution will eventually be attached to and transformed by this central agency, which will itself eventually replace government and political structures as such, the state thereby withering away into some enormous group therapy. This development is only possible at the price of a radical disjunction of base and superstructure, or of production from culture itself. We used to call this disjunction work and leisure, but hopefully the influence of Fourier will dissolve this opposition on the personal level. But in the current intellectual climate, I think it's important to insist on a radical permissiveness, on an absolute freedom in the cultural realm, including the freedom to do nothing at all and to drug yourself into oblivion. The guaranteed annual minimum wage does, of course, make this utopia a paradise for slackers. Yet this society is wealthy enough to let them go their way, and Fourier will help us absorb the envy and bitterness, the sad passions, indeed the hatred, which will follow them from other workers in this vineyard, such as the religious fundamentalists. But at our present stage of postmodernity, no future society can retreat into older kinds of order and discipline unless indeed you like that kind of thing. One imagines a multitude of distinct ideological collectivities scattered through this space, like the distinctive cities of Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. As for crime, or more accurately put, the antisocial, as someone with a horror of the death penalty and of prisons generally, I recommend a return to the old Greek and Tsarist traditions of banishment. But I also propose adoption of Samuel Delaney's magnificent institution in his utopian novel Triton of a so-called unlicensed center where no law exists and anything goes. In fact, it has occurred to me today that might be a good idea for cities generally, for people who don't want to have to live in phalansteries or hearths, as David puts it. On the other hand, it's clearly a loss of whatever we think is freedom, which is the centerpiece of all conservative, not to say anti-utopian politics, and which will certainly be reactivated with a vengeance by a plan like this for the total militarization of America. The whole history of anti-communist ideology lies here, and it's been instilled in us for 65 years, or 220, or even the thousands of years since the emergence of the state itself, depending on your periodization. It is that immemorial brainwashing and deep unconscious anti-utopian and anti-collectivist habituation which any utopian thinking must confront before it ever gets a chance to spread its wings imaginatively and positively, as Fourier was able to do. Thus, the anti-utopian imagination today, at a moment when anti-socialism has been enlarged into anti-governmental prejudice in general, is placed in the defensive position of argumentation and refutation before it can even begin to imagine. So our first task is diagnostic, to isolate the anti-utopian prejudice in order to treat it more effectively. And as for the universal utopian army I've proposed here, you have to remember that it would come into being in an age of multiple subject positions, which is to say multiple group formations, since the old-fashioned individual subject is scarcely with us any longer. Therefore, you have to remember that any member of the Universal Army will also be a member of multiple other limited groups of ethnic, cultural, lifestyle, superstructural types, and all at the same time. But the Universal Army is that fetish of unity which must persist within any coherent social order, and my wager has been that it's a different kind of fetish from those of past societies. As a unity, it subsists over and above the multiple groups and associations that are the content of our individual lives in a different way than the old-fashioned state. And I think with that, I'll end. Thank you very much.
I'm going to confine my remarks to some commentary on Fred's provocative paper. In the context of that commentary, I'll introduce some ideas that might not have been made explicit. The first question I want to address is the problem of utopia itself. The beginning of Jameson's paper seems to indicate that the utopian project is virtually impossible, as also revolution is impossible. And what it reminded me of when I read the paper, I have a copy of most of it, not all of it. He fooled around with the paper that I have, so I had to even listen. I'm just kidding. Marcuse's End of Utopia in his 5 lectures makes a coherent, it seems to me, a cogent argument that one of the reasons that utopia is no longer possible is because if utopia represents the impossible, then developed capitalist society, much less other societies that are not developed, have reached a point where, at the global level, almost everything is possible. And if everything is possible, then the problem is no longer the problem of utopia. The problem is the problem of some kind of vision, on the one hand, which we heard tonight, or late this afternoon, and another kind of politics. I would suggest that nothing that Fred has proposed, including the universal army and the transformation of the state, which is quite a big idea, and I'm going to try to unpack it a little bit, is impossible any longer because we've reached a stage of human history where we have the means, both scientific, technological, as well as cultural, to actually change things without worrying about the issue of scarcity. A little discursive point here. Scarcity today is manufactured. And I think that's implied in what Fred says. It's manufactured. We have what late capitalism requires is the invocation of scarcity as fear, as one of the aspects of fear, and that as long as that fear is prevalent, then what happens is that all possibility of change from the point of view of subjectivity is foreclosed. And so what people do now, for the most part, I'm going to qualify that in a minute, is they fight to preserve the past. And that past, generally speaking, both in the United States and in Western Europe, is really the preservation of the social welfare state in the face of the onslaught of the right. And so we haven't got time, nor do we have space, the emotional or the mental space, for the vision. And because we don't have time for the vision, the possibility of even alternatives that might be possible are no longer entertained. So that for the sake of argument, as Fred has indicated, if we thought about the state no longer in the old way as a possible future, the state as an organization, as a coordinating agency rather than an executive agency. And that's an idea, by the way, which is very, very important if you're going to do anything. You've got to eliminate the power of the state to direct the workforces, to direct culture, to direct everything of our lives. The police function of the state must be severely limited. If you're going to look upon the state as a coordinating function and also a provision of certain kinds of benefits that are made possible by the development that we have already witnessed, then we have the question of what happens to the rest of the population. What happens to social life? What happens to cultural life? And the suggestion that he makes, which I find completely compatible with my own vision of the future, is that we now have the possibility of doing almost everything. We can tolerate as a society those who choose not to work. Because, as some of you may know, I don't believe that we have much work left. We are in the midst of the jobless present, and in 1994 I wrote a book with a graduate at the Graduate Center, Bill DeFazio, we called it The Jobless Future. We don't really have, we have work, don't misunderstand me, there's plenty of work and people are working their fingers to the bone, much of it is unnecessary. Well, yeah. Well, how do you keep people disciplined? You keep people disciplined by keeping their nose to the grindstone 8, 10, 12, 15 hours a day. We don't need that anymore. And we don't need it globally. And so the first real question that we have to address is the question of, is this utopia, or is really this exploring the possibilities that have already been created by even the evils of the capitalist system? I take the position, essentially, that nothing is impossible anymore. I agree with Marcuse and with Fred in this respect. I want to take up a second question. And that is, it seems to me, and I don't want to use the word model. Well, I'm going to use the word model because, in a sense, it is a model. It is also, it is not a fantasy, that in the revolutionary period, the Chinese, especially the 8th Route Army, in the revolutionary period, the Chinese implemented the politics that Fred is actually talking about. It became essentially the army became the administrator of virtually all of the benefits of civilization that were possible at that time. It redistributed land and took it away later on. It provided public education. It provided health care. It actually fostered initially, I'm talking about the 30s and 40s, initially an agricultural policy that fed a lot of people. It killed a lot of people too. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not supporting the Chinese in this respect. But there is a model here that has to be taken seriously. And it was done through the army because there was no other institution in China that was able to do that. You didn't have the division of labor at the level of the state. The state was completely corrupt and also decentralized in the hands of warlords. So you had a different kind of model. That question is a significant question. What institution would be capable of organizing the economic and social life of society without infringing on freedom, both collective freedom and personal freedom? And here's where the first genuine controversy would have to be addressed, it seems to me, in Jameson's paper. Can we assume that a bureaucracy, and we're not going to all be bureaucrats, I'm sorry to say that, but can we assume that a bureaucracy which has got enormous responsibilities, even though that bureaucracy includes putatively, that is to say, tendentially, much of the whole population? I'm not so sure that that's it. He hasn't figured it out. I haven't figured it out from his paper. Can we assume that a bureaucracy is going to sit still, is going to be simply a coordinator and will not bid for power? Now, as we have seen over and over and over again in all of the revolutions, the Chinese Revolution among them, the Russian Revolution was more complicated, Latin American revolutions for sure. In most cases, the revolutionaries, as the army, where they were the army, took power as well as controlled the society. and the degree of personal as well as collective freedom was severely restricted. That's a problem. I'm not going to suggest a solution at the moment, because I do hope that what we could do is what Fred suggests, which is to relegate the state, whether it be in the form of the Army or be in another form, to a coordinating agency, but that would require having to address at some point the question of what it means to have or to take or not to take power. And the struggle for power always entails these contradictions. You want a state which is not going to oppress the people on the one hand. On the other hand, you have a state which is going to oppress the people. And so the anarchist proposal for the elimination of the state has a partial truth which I want to simply put on the table. There is a long history, which some of you may know, of the debate within Marxism, and Fred alludes to that debate, about the question of the transition from capitalism to communism. And the transition was called socialism. Let's not fool around. The revolution is not about the revolution to socialism. The revolution is a revolution to communism. But in the socialist phase, namely the phase where you have a state, you still have to have the repressive function of the state. You still have to have an army, and so on. The problem with the transition, as we have seen, at the very least since 1917, the problem with the transition is that the transition becomes permanent. Now, certain Marxists have tried to ascribe that permanence to the underdevelopment question. And I think Fred has done a very good job in deconstructing the concept of development and underdevelopment. If we do not insist on the doctrine of progress in relationship to development and underdevelopment, then we might have to come to the conclusion that the radical transformation in the nature of, as well as the function of the state, is a condition for the possibility of social transformation. And that's what he proposes. And that's what every anarchist or quasi-anarchist, I myself do not come out of the anarchist tradition, I come out of the council communist tradition, and that means that except when I was a boy Stalinist, well, I was a boy Stalinist, and you know what? I learned a lot. I really did. One of the problems of not being a girl or a boy Stalinist is that you never get into contact with certain kinds of political techniques and talents. I have some of those, and I didn't get them from reading. People are appalled by this. I mean, I don't know why people should be appalled. Anyway, but what's true is that the problem that Fred raises, the Army proposal is one possibility, but the problem that's at the core of his discourse is the problem of the state, is the problem of the form of rule, of social rule. And I must say, as a fairly careful student of political and social theory, that is the big absence, the big void, in Lacanian terms, the big lack, in the whole and all of political and social theory, except for the liberals. Once you decide that you are going to accept the democratic liberal state as a given, as a precondition for any possible change, then you have become a liberal. And it doesn't matter whether you call yourself a socialist, or call yourself a communist, or call yourself whatever, you are a liberal. And what that means essentially is you're taking the present system of political rule for granted. And the great virtue of this paper that we've just heard is that Fred does not take the present system of political rule for granted. What's the part of it that needs to be of the anarchism that needs to be discussed? And that is, how would we organize economic, political, and social life? The army is, in some sense, a proposal that would still need content. And the argument that is made by the councilists, names Karl Korsch, Paul Matic, Anton Pannekoek, who broke with the Communist Party during the Bolshevik Revolution, right after the Bolshevik Revolution, and the argument that is made by the anarchists are very close together, and that is how that society must be organized to a large extent on the basis of councils of the people. Now, if the army becomes that kind of council, we can call it anything you want, the psychoanalytic something or other, or the army or whatever, but in fact, it becomes radically decentralized. And that's the real message. The message of this paper is the radical decentralization of social rule. I've got a couple of more things and I'll stop. Practical issues. I entirely agree with the statement that if you have, never mind about whether it's a question of the army. Yes, you have to do it if you are, as this new institution of the possibility of democratic, small d, social moral and the provision of wide areas of economic life. You have to eliminate the draft, eliminate the volunteer army and reintroduce the draft. The only time I ever got booed by large numbers of students at a public rally was at Columbia University. And this was not during the Vietnam War, it was after the Vietnam War, when Bruce Robbins and I were on a platform. Bruce Robbins, a friend, and we are on a platform, and I publicly called for the end of the draft. Boo!
For the reinstitution.
That was what I got. On the other hand, and of course I went on to explain, the volunteer army is an invitation to fascism. Once the army itself is self-selected on the basis of careers, I mean the traditional army, on the basis of careers, on the basis of being a job substitute, on the basis of being essentially a privatized army, which is one of the great points of Fred's paper, then that army is extremely dangerous for any possibility of freedom. You can't have it. You have to have a draft, and one of the things about the draft, and he kidded around, he thought maybe we'll draft 60-year-olds and have them, they won't fight any wars. But during the Vietnam War, we did not need a draft. We did not need 60-year-olds to oppose the war on the battlefront. The untold story of the end of the Vietnam War, we know about the mass movements in the United States, students and others, but on the battlefront, the soldiers were in full rebellion against the war. So if you have a draft, you have a great opportunity to have a democratic refusal to war. And war is no longer a luxury. You can't have any war anymore. At least you can't have that kind of war. And just to remind you, I mentioned reintroducing the draft to transform the present armed forces back into that popular mass force capable of coexisting successfully with an increasingly representative government into a vehicle for mass democracy rather than the representative kind. And that leads me to my final point, I suppose. And I already mentioned it. But you have to take it seriously. Representative government is not simply a limited form of democracy, it is an anti-democratic form. When you have a member of the United States Congress who is a Republican in the newspaper a week ago complaining that he cannot represent his community when his community is 700,000 people, that is numbers, and in many cases gerrymandered so that the weakest kind of contiguous population is represented by that government. When you have billions of dollars, literally, over time, being spent on electing people who are really not elected, when you have 50% of the people who do not vote and do not vote because they see no reason to vote, and they may be the smartest among us, when you have a population that only sees its possibility, and I think here I'm going to take one swipe at this piece. Direct action. Then you have a very different perspective on representative government. Representative government, only under conditions of mass uprising, has any possibility of even becoming the ushers of social change. But if you don't have mass uprising, representative government is almost inevitably reactionary. And that reactionary does not simply extend to the right, it extends to the left. The social democratic project, as Fred says, is dead. And the communists who allowed themselves to fall into that social democratic project in Western Europe, with one exception, two exceptions, but 1.5 exceptions, I'll put it another way. Greece and Germany, only small exception, but the social democratic, the communists are themselves gone because they allowed themselves to fall into the social democratic project, which was you'll hold on to the liberal state and you'll make reform. The problem is we don't necessarily you don't necessarily have to agree with this, but the evidence is pretty clear that the era of social reform of the traditional kind is no longer possible. Given the political situation, it is even increasingly unpopular and not possible, partially because of the kind of political system that has emerged in the United States and elsewhere of really one-sided, as the unions like to say, class struggle. The councilists talked about workers' councils. I don't think that's good enough. I think that's necessary but not sufficient. I think what you need is at the level of the community, at the level of schools, at the level of virtually every institution, as well as every sphere of life, you need the passing of control into the popular. Now, last word. I don't think that the defeat in Wisconsin is so simple. I think it begins a process which was carried out with Occupy, that you do not any longer have the option to take the electoral process all that seriously. You have to confront the electoral process. You have to confront the organization of space, as well as the organization of social life in general, by direct action. Now, that Occupy has refused to engage in political organization, and by which I don't mean electoral organization, I mean political organization, is a fatal weakness for that organization. But what I think has now been put on the table in the United States, and to refuse to accept that or to recognize that, is to make a serious mistake. And that is popular organizations of minorities, and I don't mean racial minorities or gender minorities alone, but the popular organization of minorities is the way to begin to implement a new democratic project. Because majoritarianism is essentially authoritarianism under these circumstances that lives now. I think I want to say one more thing about that, because, and that's it, which is that if we are in a new era, then we should expect defeats. But that the defeats may not be the end of that era, but will be preliminary. I mean, I'm not going to be cavalier to suggest a 1905 and 1917 analogy. What I'm talking about, the Russian Revolution, which failed in 1905 and succeeded in 1917. But that is a way of thinking that needs to pervade what remains of an American as well as a global left. And that kind of thinking, I think, is beginning to take hold. And the one thing that Fred has actually given us, and I'm grateful for it, is he's given us the invocation that without a vision, without a proposal for how to change or what to change to, without a discussion of what the implications of those changes are, then what we're fated to become is simply a vanishing breed of romantics and a vanishing breed of sentimentalists. Thank you. Now we have, what am I doing? The problem, is it late? No.
We take some questions for 10 minutes of questions.
So I'm happy to do that. The only problem that we have is that some people are soft-spoken. I don't happen to be soft-spoken. You do have mics? All right, where are the mics? Over here. All right. All right. I will entertain questions under this proviso. One, that you use the mic. Two, that if you have a question, it's a question, and no prolonged statements like I'm a member of the Sixth International and this is our position. None of that. So, questions? Yes, sir. Go ahead. No? All right.
Can cyberspace be a vehicle of dual power or resistance?
Well, I think there was a whole set of utopian fantasies crystallized around all that, and certainly in these mass uprisings that I touched on, it played a part. I mean, but I think that it would be more an auxiliary to other kinds of things. That is, it has a function of disclosing, revealing scandals, and so on and so forth, and calling people out. Sure. So I think, but one would have to try to imagine a more specific place for it in the scheme. I mean. The big question, I agree with Stanley that on a lot of things, I think the council idea is very interesting. It's clear that this moves towards a kind of federalized or decentralized system. Well, that's the point at which something like cyberspace comes into play, because that keeps various seemingly local and isolated communities in touch with each other. So to that degree, maybe this is a new way of overcoming the kind of breakdown that has always threatened the federal system. I think myself that, when people talk about the end of communism and so forth, and it was a failure of federalism fully as much as communism. I mean, Gorbachev didn't understand the secessions that were about to happen in the Soviet Union. So I think it would be a component of any kind of decentralization. Yeah.
One small thing: you're a mayor of Richmond, California, and you've been elected on the Green Party ticket to be the mayor of Richmond, California. And so what you do, with the support of a large number of people in Richmond, California, an old oil town, an old industrial town, is you actually reverse the eminent domain doctrine, which was used to drive farmers off the land. And so now what you do is you drive the real estate people out of the city. Now, that is not something that I made up. That is something that the mayor of Richmond, California announced, and then she backed off. We haven't figured out yet why she backed off and how she backed off. But you can figure it out for yourself. But that is an example of a decentralized action. The problem is that none of that gets disseminated widely enough so it can be imitated, improved on, discussed, and become a more general kind of activity. Yeah. Oh, over there and then there. We're going to do it. Is that okay with you? Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. As you probably hear, I'm from former Soviet Union. So I was subjected to both radical system, radical socialism and radical communism, or radical capitalism. And for 20 years, I already see this political circus here as I saw it in Soviet Union. But in Soviet Union, there was, main problem was with distribution. It was on the way to distribute all resources. People on the top distributed it in between their friends and relatives, and then to the bottom it was going only scarce amount of any resources. But, and if we talk about this problem, it's only possible, this distribution process only possible by computer system. It's not possible by, it could not be reinforced by any kind of humans, even army, because on the way to the bottom of the society, it always will be...
Can you, you have a question?
Yes, my question is, what do you think is in future utopia we will be, it's only possible, this distribution process only possible by computers, and actually we are on the way to it?
Well, you know, you talk about corruption and so on. I think that would be another use for the internet. That is, that's a source of the revelation of these things that in a lot of countries was kept secret. I mean, the East Germans were stunned to find out that that these people who ran them had these dachas and villas and so on, and that nobody really knew about. But that suggests something else here. And we've talked a lot about the state as a problem. I mean, we're not talking about solving problems here. We're talking about producing problems, right? By way of the attempt to imagine a utopia. And one of those problems clearly remains the state, as it always has been. The other one we haven't mentioned, that's money. I mean, and when you're talking about corruption, you're talking about money. When you're talking about media and so forth, you're talking about money. I mean, one of the things I think that, you know, Hegel had this scandalous expression, which I hope he didn't really mean literally. It was, war is the health of nations. I suppose he meant by that patriotism and so on and so forth. But I think what he really meant is the war destroys capital. I think this post-war situations, some of them were made things possible in Britain, for example, Labour Britain, because so much capital had been destroyed, so much money had been destroyed. What's happening to us now is that all this money has accumulated in one place, and I think you know where that place is, and it makes any kind of representative system, public media, and so forth, really very difficult, if not to say impossible. So that this kind of proposal would have to be accompanied by, I don't say redistribution of wealth, I would say destruction of wealth. It has to be accompanied by a general, how can I say, I don't want to say lowering of living standards exactly, but it certainly has to be. I think the great merit of Occupy was to put this at the center of the table where nobody was talking about it before, and it certainly it is important for us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Why don't you raise the microphone?
Sure.
Yeah,
a little bit easier. Stanley, you said in your speech at Columbia...
You got to speak louder.
Stanley, you said in your speech at Columbia that you called for the abolition of the draft.
No, you called for the reinstatement.
That's why I was wondering if you misspoke.
You called for the
Yeah, I call for the reinstatement of the draft.
That's what I thought, because the volunteer service would be, I think in your opinion, would be a step towards fascism and would ensure fascism. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I just
Okay.
wanted to make sure if you spoke or not.
It became it became the foundation of the democratic struggle against the war in Vietnam. against the Southeast Asian War was the fact that there was a draft. And Richard Nixon, who was no dope, decided, how do you get rid of the movement? You get rid of the movement by eliminating the draft and have everybody booing Aronowitz. No, that was, but that's the, I mean, that kind of thing happened all over. Yes. One more question, right? Two more questions, Andre. Okay.
Hi, I'm Rachel.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could say more about how we get from where we are now to your imagined future. So what is the mechanism, and how might the mechanism or the process shape the ultimate outcome of the future political organizations that you're thinking about?
That's a good question.
Well, I don't know exactly what the legalities are, but it seems to me that among the president's powers would be to reinstitute the draft as an executive action, and that could be extended and so on and so forth. I mean, you're asking for practical implementation. That's one way of imagining it. The other way is what Stanley has talked about in terms of popular organization and so forth. But there's an answer.
We are in a stage. I mean, if it is a stage, let's stipulate that possibility. We are in a moment anyway, when the basic issue is not how to get from here to there in the abstract. The basic issue is, where are we going to find the cadre? Where are we going to find the activists who are going to not only fight for the draft, as one example, or fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage? We know how to do that. I'm not saying that we're successful yet, but a group of people of several hundred thousand, not a large group to start with, who actually will dedicate themselves to the elaboration of a new way of thinking about society. And not that we don't learn from Marx or learn from Lenin or learn from Aristotle or learn from anybody else, but there are new problems. And one of the problems that Fred raises, which and has to be raised, is the framework of industrialization dead, or has it been transferred to virtually every aspect of work and of social life? That is to say, can we think through the issue of hierarchy? Can we think through the issue of authority in every aspect of our lives? Now, when people don't do any of that, and not just think through, but think about how you're going to address that in practical terms, then what they ask for is for the state and its representative government to confer upon us its benefits. I get every day, I get 3 times a day, a request for me to sign a petition to Obama, to this one, to that one. And the truth of the matter is that every now and then, if the petition is sufficiently local, I'll sign it. If it says, de Blasio, get the goddamn pre-kindergarten program going, I'll sign that. I won't sign a single petition to Obama. It's worthless. And it's really not going to change anything.
Let me add another little more serious bit to my answer to you. It is not a happy one, I think, that this kind of transformation that we're talking about, that I was talking about, I mean this utopian army and so forth, that only happens in emergencies. Now, this scheme of mine was predicated on excluding foreign policy and war. So that's a first limit. But it seems to me it's only in a national emergency, and that, I think, for us then means ecology, that you can do something like this. You draft everybody, and they have to help out in that situation. And those things are probably coming, so it's not maybe quite so imaginary or fantasized as that. But that's the moment in which one can effectuate that kind of transformation, I think.
You got the final question.
Okay, thanks. I think what I find maybe disappointing about this exercise so far, maybe more in what Stanley was saying, is that when we try to think of in a utopian register some kind of total transformation, but we continue to talk about the completely transformed situation in terms of the same kind of economic rationality that we're in thrall of, or that we're using. In other words, how are we going to, okay, we've got this utopia. Now how are we going to distribute scarce resources on a global scale again? Okay, let's decentralize, or let's use computer networks to achieve that. We've in no way escaped the kind of economic rationality or even a global market that we're in. So in other words, my question is, why is it that even when we try, as hard as you've both tried, to think of a way of exiting this world, broadly speaking, why can't we escape from this kind of economic rationality? Especially since we've recognized, you've both recognized, and we here have all recognized to varying degrees that what this kind of economic rationality has been doing to this world and to this planet has brought it not to the brink of apocalypse, but well into the midst of a slowly unfolding apocalypse that we're living through right now.
I thought we had eliminated the banks and the big corporations and so forth and destroyed some of the money supply. I recommend, as these are just suggestions, I recommend two other books I didn't mention. Ernst Kallenbach's great book, Utopia, which has just been republished, and an even more forgotten book by an East German, Rudolf Bahro, B-A-H-R-O, called The Alternative, which has to make some similar proposals for the former socialist system. I mean, those are maybe more practical beginnings than, but Kallenbach shows that you can have a lot of dynamism and innovation and all the rest of it in a system that doesn't depend on big business.
Just one little comment. Imagine what kind of a society, what kind of life, social life we would have if we took up a simple demand of somebody called Karl Marx in the 1850s, that the purpose of the movement that he was hoping to ignite, its primary purpose was the abolition of the wage system, which would entail the abolition of money. Now, one of the reasons that Aristotle and a certain number of people, especially Aristotle and Hegel and Marx and a few others, we still read them, is not only because their analysis is good, but because they challenge the foundation of the systems within which they lived. We can't regard market as religion. It is only a religion. And we've got to begin to think, how would we organize social and economic life outside of the market? And how do we begin to think about what constitutes a good life? I've just finished a book, which is going to be published in the fall, about this forgotten organization called the labor movement. And what I argue in that book is that one of the reasons that we've seen the precipitous decline of the U.S. labor movement and the slower decline of the European labor movement, but both of them are surely declining. Europe we like to hold up because we're in such terrible shape here, is because they lost the grasp of what it means to offer a good life to masses of people. They no longer speak that way. They no longer have the language. They no longer have the ideas. They no longer have the educational project. And it reminds me, because what was true about Plato and Aristotle and Marx and Hegel and so on is that they always insisted on the problem of not only the process by which we get from this life to the good life, but what the good life might consist in. And we might not like Hegel's Republic because, the Marxist analysis of Hegel's Republic, in Plato's Republic, is that Plato was simply justifying the system within which he lived. I don't agree with that, by the way. But he actually becomes powerful to the extent that he suggests what it would be like to have a system of democracy or hierarchy, and he has both of them going on at the same time. We don't talk that way anymore. That's what's so strong about Fred's paper. He's talking that way, and that's what we have to do more of.